So my microscope stream that I was attempting did not work. So I'm just going to read this time. Do I want to start with like Geo, follow the House of Usher? Follow the House of Usher. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day. Oh gosh, can you guys hear me okay? Testing, testing. Is the sound working okay? Usually it has the little thingy there when I'm... Yeah. Well, hopefully you guys can hear me. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length I found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom had pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of the half pleasurable, because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and simple landscape and features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant, eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with utter depression of soul, which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought, which no goading of the imagination would torture into the aught of sublime. What was it? I paused to think. What was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the House of Usher? It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced back to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while beyond a doubt there are combinations of simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depths. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify, or perhaps to annihilate, its capacity for sorrowful impression. And acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink, black and lurid tarn that lay in unfurled lustre by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling before, upon the remodelled and inverted images of the grey sedge, ghastly tree stems, and the vacant and eye-like windows. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now proposed to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in childhood, but many years. Let's see, is this working any better? I don't think it's picking up the sound, is it? Oh well, whatever. Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now proposed to make to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, one Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in childhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him, which, in its wildly inopportune nature, had oh, which in its wildly importunate nature, what that means, has admitted of no other than a personal reply. The MS gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke acutely of a bodily illness, the mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me, as his best and indeed only personal friend, with a view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation to his malady. It was the manner in which all of this and much more was said, and as it was the apparent heart that went with his request, which allowed me no room for hesitation. I accordingly obeyed forthwith that which I still consider a very singular summons. Although as boys we had been intimate associates, I really knew very little of my friend. His reserve had been always excessive and habitual. I was aware, however, that his very ancient family had been noted, time of time out of mind, for a peculiar sensibility of temperament, displaying itself through long ages in many works of exalted art, and manifested of late in repeated deeds of munificent yet unobtrusive charity, as well as a passion in devotion to the intricacies, perhaps even more so than to the unorthodox and easily recognizable beauties of musical science. I had learned, too, the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all honored time as it was, all honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. In other words, the entire family lay in the direct line of descent, and had always, with very trifling and yet very temporary variation, so lain. It was this deficiency I considered, while running over in thought the perfect keeping of the character of the premises with the accredited character of the people, and while speculating upon the possible influence which the one in the long lapse of centuries might have exercised on the other, it was the delicate it was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue, and the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name, which had at length identified the two to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include, in the minds of the peasantry who used it, both the family and the mansion. I have said that the sole effect of my somewhat childish experiment, that of looking down within the tarn, had begun to deepen the first singular impression. There can be no doubt that the consequences of rapid increase in my superstition, for why should I not so term it, served mainly to accelerate the increase itself. Such as I have long known is the paradoxical law of all sentiments having terror as a basis. And it might have been for this reason only that when I again uplifted my eyes to the house itself from its image in a pool, that there grew in my mind a strange fancy, so ridiculous indeed, that I mentioned to show the vivid force of sensations which oppressed me. I had so worked upon my imagination as to really believe that about the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere so peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees, the gray wall, silent tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapor, dull, sluggish, faintly discernible, and leaden-hued. Shaking off from my spirit, which must have been a dream, I scanned more narrowly the real aspect of the building. Its principal feature seemed that of an excessive antiquity. The discoloration of ages had been great. Minute fungi overspread the whole exterior, hanging in a fine tangle of webwork from the eaves. Yet all of this was apart from any extraordinary dilapidation. No portion of the masonry had fallen. There appeared to be a wild inconsistency in between its still perfect adaptation of parts and the crumbling condition of the individual studs. In this, there was much that reminded me of the specious totality of old woodwork which had rotted for long years in a neglected vault, with no disturbance from beneath the breath of external air. Beyond the indication of excessive decay, however, the fabric gave little token of instability. Perhaps the eye of a scrutinizing observer might have discovered a barely perceptible fissure, which, extending from the roof of the building in the front, made its way down in the wall in a zigzag direction until it became lost in the sullen waters of the tarn. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A valet of stealthy step thence conducted me, in silence, through many dark and intricate passages in my progress to the studio of his master. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I've already spoken. While the objects around me, the carvings of the ceilings, the somber tapestries on the walls, the ebon blackness of the floors, and the phantasmagoric armorial trophies which rattled as I strode, were but matters to which, or such as, or to such as which I had been accustomed from my infancy. While I hesitated not to acknowledge how familiar I was with all of this, I still wondered to find how unfamiliar were the fancies which ordinary images were stirring up. On one of the staircases, I met the family physician. His countenance, I thought, wore a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity. He accosted me with trepidation and passed on. The valet now threw open the door and ushered me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and at so vast a distance from the vast oaken floor as to be entirely inaccessible within. Feeble gleams of encrimsoned light that made their way through the trellised panes served to render sufficiently distinct the more prominent objects around. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the remoter angles of the chamber, or the recesses of the vaulted and fretted ceiling. Dark draperies hung on the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. An air of stern, deep, and irredeemable gloom hung over and pervaded all. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from a sofa on which he had been lying at full length, and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it, I first thought, of overdone cordiality, the constrained effort of the ingenue man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down. For some moments while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling of half pity, half awe. Surely man had never before been so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverousness of complexion, an eye large, liquid, and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surpassingly beautiful curve, a nose of a delicate Hebrew model, but with breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a finely molded chin, speaking, in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of a more web-like softness and tenuity. These features, with an inordinate expansion above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not to be easily forgotten. And now In the mere exaggeration of the prevailing character of these features, the expressions they were wont to convey, lay so much of the change that I doubted whom I spoke to. The now ghastly pallor of the skin, and the now miraculous luster of the eye, above all things, startled and even awed me. It's cold. It's cold in here. The silken hair, too, had been suffered to grow all unheeded, as in its wild gossamer texture it floated rather than fell about the face. I could not, even with effort, connect its arabesque expression with any idea of simple humanity. In the manner of which my friend and I once struck, I'm tongue tied here. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome a habitual trepidancy, an excessive nervous agitation. For something of the nature, I had indeed been prepared, no less by his letter than by reminiscences of certain boyish traits, and conclusions deduced from his peculiar physical conformation and temperament. His action was alternately vivacious and sullen. His voice varied rapidly from tremendous indecision, when the animal spirits seemed utterly in abeyance, to the species of energetic concision, that abrupt, weighty, unhurried, and hollow sounding enunciation, the leaden, self balanced, and perfectly modulated guttural utterance, which may be observed in the lost drunkard, or the irredeemable eater of opium, during the periods of his most intense excitement. It was thus that he spoke of the object of his visit, his earnest desire to see me, and the solace he expected me to afford him. He entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, a constitutional and family evil, and one for which he despaired to find a remedy. A mere nervous affliction, he immediately added, which would undoubtedly soon pass off. It displayed itself in a host of unnatural sensations. Some of these, as he detailed them, interested and bewildered me, although perhaps the terms and general manner of their narration had their weight. He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could only wear garments of a certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured even by a faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments, which did not inspire him with horror. To the anomalous species of terror I found him a bounden slave. I shall perish, said he. I must perish in this deplorable folly. Thus, and not otherwise shall I be lost. I dread the events of the future, not in themselves, but in their results. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident, which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I have, indeed, no abhorrence of danger, except in its absolute effect, in terror. In this unnerved, in this pitiable condition, I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantasm of fear. I learned, moreover, at intervals and through broken and equivocal hints, another singular feature of my friend's mental condition. He was enchained by certain superstitions and impressions in the regard to the dwelling which he tenanted, and whence for many years he never ventured forth, in regard to influence whose supposititious force was conveyed in terms too shadowy here to be restated, an influence of which some peculiar tongue tied again. An influence which some peculiarities in the mere form and substance of his family mansion had, by the dint of long sufferance, he said, obtained over his spirit, an effect which the physique of the grey walls and turrets, and of the dim tarn into which they all looked down, had at length brought about the morale of his existence. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin. Severe and long continued illness, indeed, the evidently approaching delusion of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease, he said with bitterness, which I can never forget, would leave him the hopeless and frail, the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so she was called, passed through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with utter astonishment, not unmingled with dread, and yet I found it impossible to account for such feelings. A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps. When a door at length closed upon her, my glance sought instinctively and eagerly the countenance of the brother, but he had buried his face in his hands, and I could only perceive that a far more ordinary wanness had overspread the emaciated fingers through which trickled many passionate tears. The disease of Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and a frequent, although transient, affectations of a particularly cataleptical character were the unusual diagnoses. Hitherto, she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady, and had not betaken herself finally to bed. But on the closing of the evening at my arrival to the house, she succumbed, as her brother told me in the night, to the prostrating power of the destroyer, and I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person was thus probably the last I obtained. The lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. For several days ensuing, her name was unmentioned by either Usher or myself, and during this period I was busied in earnest endeavors to alleviate the melancholy of my friend. We painted, read together, or I listened as if in a dream the wild improvisations of his speaking guitar. And thus, as a closer and still closer intimacy admitted me more unreservedly into the recesses of his spirit, the more bitterly did I perceive the futility of all attempt at cheering a mind from which darkness, as if an inherent positive quality, poured forth upon all objects of the moral and physical universe in one unceasing radiation of gloom. I shall ever bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the House of Usher. Yet I should fail in any attempt to convey an idea of the exact character of the studies or the occupations in which he involved me or led the way. An excited and highly distempered ideality threw a sulphurous luster over all. His long improvised dirges will ring forever in my ears. Among other things, I hold painfully in mind a certain singular perversion and amplification of the wild air, the last waltz of von Weber. From the paintings over which his elaborate fancy brooded, and which grew, touch by touch, into vagueness, at which I shuddered the more thrillingly, because I shuddered not knowing why, from these paintings, vivid as their images are now before me. I would in vain endeavor to adduce more than a small portion of what should lie within the compass of merely written words. But utter simplicity, by the nakedness of his designs, he arrested and overawed attention. If ever mortal painted an idea, that mortal was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, the circumstances then surrounding me, there arose of the pure out of the pure abstractions which the hypochondriac contrived to throw upon his canvas, an intensity, an intolerable awe, no shadow of which I felt, yet which I had yet felt in the contemplation of the certainly glowing, yet too concrete, reveries of Fuseli. One of the phantasmagoric conceptions of my friend, partaking not so rigidly in the spirit of abstraction, may be shadowed forth, although feebly in words. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault or tunnel, with low walls, smooth white, and without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed in any portion of its vast extent, and no torch or other artificial source of light was discernible. Yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout, bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. I have just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve which rendered music intolerable to the sufferer, with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was, perhaps, the narrow limit to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar which gave birth, in great measure, to the fantastic character of his performances. But the fervid facility of his impromptus could not be accounted for. They must have been, were in the notes, as well in the worlds of his wild fantasies, for he not unfrequently accompanied himself with rhymed verbal improvisations. The result of that intense mental connectedness and concentration to which I have previously alluded, as observable only in the particular moments of highest artificial excitement. The words of one of these rhapsodies I've easily remembered. It was, perhaps, more forcibly impressed as when he gave it, because under the mist in because in the under or mystic current of its meaning, I fancied that I perceived, and for the first time, a full consciousness on the part of Usher of the tottering of his lofty reason upon her throne. The verses, which were entitled The Haunted Palace, ran very nearly, not accurately, thus. In the greatest of in the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace reared its head. In the monarch of thought's dominion, it stood there. Never a seraph spread opinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on its roof did float and flow. This, all this, was in the olden time, long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day upon the ramparts, plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in that happy valley through two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne, where sitting Porphyrogene, in his state of in state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen, and all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, 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 and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things, in robes of sorrow, assaulted the monarch's high estate. Oh, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travelers now within the valley, through red-litten windows, see vast forms that move fantastically to discordant melody, while like a rapid ghastly river through the pale door a hideous throng rush out forever, and laugh, but smile no more. I well remember the suggestions arising from this ballad that led us into a train of thought wherein there became manifest an opinion of Usher's, which I mention not so much on account of its novelty, for other men have thought this, but on its account of pertinency with which he maintained it. The opinion of in its general form, was that of the sentience of all vegetable things. But in his disordered fancy, the idea had assumed a more daring character trespassed under certain conditions upon the kingdom of inorganization. I lack words to express the full extent or earnest abandon of his persuasion. The belief, however, which was connected, as I have previously hinted, with the gray stones of the home of his forefathers. The conditions of the sentience had been there, he imagined, fulfilled in the method of collocation of these stones, the order of their arrangement, as well as the many fungi which overspread them, and of the decayed trees which stood around. Above all, and in the long, undisturbed endurance of this arrangement, and in its reduplication in the still waters of the tarn, its evidence, the evidence of sentience, was to be seen, he said. And here I started as he spoke. In the gradual, yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own. Oh, I have no idea why I'm yawning here, but whatever. Where was I? In the gradual yet certain condensation of an atmosphere of their own about the waters and the walls. The result was discoverable, he added, in that silent yet importunate and terrible influence for which centuries had molded him and the destinies of his family, and which made him what I now saw him, what he was. Such opinions need no comment. I will make none. Our books, the books which for years he informed, which for years had formed no small portion of the mental existence of an invalid, were, as might be supposed, in strict keeping with his character of phantasm. We pored together over many works, and okay, it's a long list of books, and this is a long list of books he's referencing, and I cannot pronounce all of them, so I'm just going to skip this little paragraph. We pored together over books over which Usher would sit dreaming for hours. His chief delight, however, was found in the perusal and exceedingly rare and curious book in quarto Gothic, the Manual of a Forgotten Church, the Vigilae Mortuorum Secundum Coram Ecclesiae Magunciae. My Latin is also rusty. I cannot pronounce French. I can't pronounce the French words that were in the previous paragraph. And now the Latin title here is giving me trouble, despite the fact that I took 4 years away to college. Anyway, back to the book. I could not help thinking of the wild ritual of this work, and of its profitable influence upon the hypochondriac, when one evening, having informed me abruptly that Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight previous to its final interment in one of the numerous vaults in the main walls of the building. The worldly reason, however, assigned for this singular proceeding was one which I did not feel at liberty to dispute. The brother had been led to his resolution, so as he told me, by consideration of the unusual character of the malady of the deceased, of certain obtrusive and eager inquiries on the part of medical men, and the remote and exposed situation of the burial ground of the family. I will not deny that when I called to mind the sinister when I called to mind the sinister countenance of the person whom I met upon the staircase on the day of my arrival, I had no desire to oppose what was regarded at best but a harmless and by no means unnatural precaution. I keep yawning. It's just something that happens when I read aloud for too long. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for temporary entombment. The body having been encoffined, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it, and which had been so long unopened that our torches, half smothered in its atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation, was small, damp, and entirely without admission of light, lying at great depth immediately beneath the portion of the building in which was my own sleeping arrangement. It had been used, apparently, in remote feudal times for the worst purpose of a dungeon keep, and in later days as a deposit for powder or some other highly combustible substance, as a portion of its floor, and the whole interior of a long archway through which we reached it were carefully sheathed with copper. The door, of massive iron, was also similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges. Having deposited our mournful burden upon the trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between the brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some few words from which I learned the deceased and himself had been twins, and that the sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unwed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left, as usual in all maladies of a strictly cataleptical character, the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and face, and the suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip, which is so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door made of iron, made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper part of the house. And now, some days of bitter grief having elapsed, an observable change came of the features of the mental disorder of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal, and objectless step. The pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminousness of his eyes had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskiness of his tone was heard no more, and a tremulous quaver, as if of extreme terror, habitually characterized his utterance. There were times, indeed, when I thought this unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge what he struggled for the necessary courage. At times, I was obliged to resolve all into mere inexplicable vagaries of madness. for which I held him ga- for which I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours, in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me, by slow yet certain degrees, the wild influence of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was especially upon retiring to the bed late at night of the seventh or eighth day after the placing of Lady Madeline within the dungeon that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came nowhere near my couch, while the hours waned and waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominion over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all of what I felt, was due to the bewildering influence of gloomy furniture in the room, the dark and tattered tapestries which, tortured into motion by the breath of a rising tempest, swayed fitfully to and fro upon the walls, rustled uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a gasp and struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened, I know not why, except that an instinctive spirit prompted me, to certain low and indefinite sounds which came through the pauses of the storm at long intervals, I know not whence. Overpowered with an intense sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet unendurable, I threw on my clothes with haste, as I felt I should sleep no more during that night, and I endeavored to arouse myself from the pitiable condition into which I had fallen, by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment. I had taken but few turns in the manner, when a light step on an adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. In an instant after he rapped, with a gentle touch at my door, he, he entered bearing a lamp. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, but, moreover, there was a species of mad hilarity in his eyes, and evidently restrained hysteria in his whole demeanor. His air appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude in which I had so long endured, and I even welcomed his presence with relief. And you have not seen it, he said abruptly, after having stared about him for moments in silence. You have not seen it? But stay, you shall. Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements and threw it freely open to the storm. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous, sternly beautiful night, one wildly singular, Hmm. In its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, for there were frequent and violent alterations in the direction of the wind, and the exceeding density of the clouds, which were so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, did not present our perceiving the lifelike velocity with which they flew, careering from all points against each other, without passing away into the distance. I say, even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this. Yet we have had no glimpse of the moon or stars, nor was there any flashing forth of the lightning. But under the surfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous exhalation which hung about and enshrouded the mansion. You must not, you shall not behold this, I said, shuddering to Usher, and I led him with a gentle violence from the window to a seat. These appearances which bewilder you are merely an electrical phenomena not uncommon, or it may be that they have their ghastly origin in the rank miasma of the tarn. Let us close this easement. The air is chilly and dangerous to your frame. Here is one of your favorite romances. I'll read, you listen, and so we will pass away this terrible night together. The antique volume which I had taken up was The Mad Tryst of Sir Lancelot Canning, but I called it, as a favorite of Usher's, more in sad jest than in earnest. In truth, there is very little in its uncouth and unimaginative proximity which would have interest for the lofty and spiritual ideality of my friend. It was, however, the only book immediately at hand. I indulged a vague hope that the excitement which now agitated the hypochondriac might find relief, for the history of mental disorder is full of similar anomalies, even in the extremeness of the folly in which I should read. Could I have judged, indeed, by the wild, overstrained air of the vicinity with which he hearkened, or apparently hearkened, the words of the tale, I might well have congratulated myself upon the success of my design. I had arrived at the well-known portion of the story where Ethelred, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good entrance by force, which will always be remembered as the words running thus: and Ethelred, who was by nature of a doughy heart, and who was now mighty withal, on account of the powerfulness of the wine the wine which he had drunken, waited no longer to hold parley with the hermit, who, in sooth, was of an obstinate and maliceful turn, but feeling the rain upon his shoulders and the rising of the tempest, uplifted his mace outright, and with blows made quickly room in the plankings of the door for his gauntleted hand. And now, pulling therewith sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder that the noise of the dry and hollow sounding wood alarmed and reverberated throughout the forest. At the termination of this sentence, I started, and for a moment paused, for it appeared to me, although I at once concluded that my excited fancy had deceived me, it appeared to me that for some very remote portion of the mansion there came indistinctly to my ears what might have been in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but stifled and dull certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Lancelot had so here particularly described. It was beyond a doubt the coincidence alone which arrested my attention, for amid the rattling of sashes and casements, and the ordinary commingled noises of the still increasing storm, the sound, in itself, had nothing, surely, which should have interested or disturbed me. I concluded the story, but the good champion Ethelred, now entering within the door, was sore enraged and amazed to perceive no signal of the maliceful hermit, but instead thereof a dragon of scaly and prodigious demeanour, and of fiery tongue, which sate in guard before a palace of gold with floor of silver, and upon which there hung a shield of shining brass with this legend ever enwritten: Who entereth herein a conqueror hath been, who slayeth the dragon, the shield he shall win. And Ethelred uplifted his mace and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave up his pesty breath, with a shriek so horrid and harsh that Ethelred had fain to close his ears with his hands against the noise of it, like the like whereof had never before heard. Here I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there was no doubt whatever that in this instance I did actually hear, although from what direction it proceeded, I found impossible to say, a low, apparently distant, but harsh, protracted, and most unnatural screaming or grating sound, the exact counterpart of which my fantasy had conjured up for the dragon's unusual shriek, as described by the romancer. Oppressed as I certainly was upon the occurrence of this second and most extraordinary coincidence, by 1,000 conflicting sensations, in which wonder and extreme terror were predominant, I still retained sufficient presence of mind to avoid exciting, by any observation, the sensitive nervousness of my companion. I was by no means certain that he had noticed the sounds in question, although assuredly a strange alteration had, during the past few minutes, taken place in his demeanour. From a position fronting my own, he gradually brought round his chair, so as to sit face to face with the door of the chamber, and thus I could partially perceive his features, although I saw his lips tremble, as if he were murmuring inaudibly. His head dropped upon his breast, yet I knew he was not asleep from the wide and rigid opening of the eye, as I caught a glance of it in profile. The motion of his body, too, was at variance with the idea, for he rocked from side to side with a gentle yet constant and uniform sway. Having rapidly taken notice of all this, I resumed the narrative of Sir Lancelot, which proceeded. And the champion now, having escaped the terrible fury of the dragon, bethinking himself of the brazen shield, and of the breaking up of the enchantment which was upon it, removed the carcass from out of the way before him, and approached valorously over the silver pavement of the castle, to where the shield was hung upon the wall, which in sooth tarried not for his full coming, but fell down at his feet upon the silver floor, with a mighty, great, and terrible ringing sound. No sooner than these syllables had passed past my lips, then, as if a shield of brass indeed, at the moment, falling heavily upon a floor of silver, I became aware of a distinct, hollow, metallic and clangorous, yet apparently muffled reverberation. Completely unnerved, I leapt to my feet, but the measured, rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. His eyes were bent fixedly before him, and throughout his whole countenance there resigned a stone rigidity. But I placed my hand upon his shoulder, and there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered above his lips, and I saw he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibbering murmur, as if unconscious of my presence. Bending closely over him, I at length drank in the hideous import of his words. Now do you hear it? Yes, I hear it, or have heard it. Long, long, many minutes, many hours, many days, have I heard it, dared not. Oh, pity me, miserable wretch that I am, I dared not speak. We put her living in the tomb. Said I not my senses were acute? I now tell you the first feeble movements in the hollow coffin. I heard them many days ago, yet I dared not speak. And now tonight, Ethelred, ha! The breaking of the hermit's door, death cry of the dragon, clangor of the shield, say, rather, the rending of her coffin, and the grating of iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault. Oh, whither shall I fly? Will she not be here anon? Is she not hurrying to upbraid me for my haste? Have I not heard her footstep on the stair? Do I not distinguish the heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! He here sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out the syllables, as if the effort were giving up his soul. Madman, I tell you, she now stands without the door. And as if a superhuman energy of his utterance, there had been found the potency of his spell. The huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back upon the instant their ponderous and ebony jaws. It was the work of a rushing gust. But then without those doors, there stood the unlawful there did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood upon her white robes, the evidence of some bitter struggle upon every portion of her emaciated frame. For a moment she remained trembling and reeling to and fro upon the threshold. Then, with a low moaning cry, fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, in her violently and now final death agonies, bore him to the floor a corpse, to the terror and a victim to the terrors he had anticipated. From that chamber and from the mansion I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath, and I found myself crossing the old causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light. I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have been issued. The vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full setting, blood-red moon, which now shone vividly through that once barely discernible fissure, of which I had spoken as extending from the roof of the building in a zigzag direction to the base. While I gazed, the fissure rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder, and there was a long, tumultuous shouting sound, like the voice of 1,000 waters. And the deep and the dark tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher. Well, my voice is getting awfully tired. I think I am going to have to lay down soon. No, not just for the. I think I'm going to have to be quiet soon. Because, see. My voice is getting tired, and I'm getting cold. Yeah. Yes, it is getting cold in here. What is the temperature outside even? I'm gonna have to look that up. I'm curious now. Oh, that's why. It's 14 degrees outside. 14 Fahrenheit. I think that translates to something like -5 or 10 Celsius. I don't know. Google that. Let me Google that. It's -10 out if you go by Celsius. Yeah. That is a normal winter night here. Yeah. The it's normal for it to get down for it to get below 20 degrees, occasionally below 0 Fahrenheit at night here. But if it stays at in the teens or 20s all day, if it stays in the teens during the day, that's cold. And of course, I have my space heater on the lowest setting. So, of course, it's cold. Anyway, I will be going now so I can lay down and stuff. Bye.